So I'm going to continue talking about the Hispanic presence in the church. So clearly, Hispanic growth, demographic change in general is making a big impact on American society and as well, of course, American Catholicism. Nearly half of all immigrants to the US are Catholic, and two-thirds or less, almost two-thirds of Hispanics who come here identify as Catholic. So these tides of immigration are really keeping the Catholic Church as strong in terms of population presence as it has been, despite the fluidity of people leaving the church. The many, many streams of immigrants coming in are keeping the actual percentage of Catholics of the larger American population quite stable. So it's like been about 24% for much of the 20th century. And sometimes, of course, commentators will point out that the Catholic Church would be a much weaker institution and a much weaker denomination if it weren't for immigration, because of all the Hispanics. But I usually point out that if all the waves of immigrants from Europe didn't come in the 19th century, the Catholic Church would be a very different place. So, you know, the Catholicism, because people forget that, Catholicism is always an ongoing tradition, and it moves in response to larger changes in the society. So anytime someone says, well, the Catholic Church would have collapsed without Hispanics coming in, we can say it certainly would have collapsed without the Irish. I'm not so sure about the Italians, but anyway, so immigration is a positive thing, really, a positive resource for society and certainly for Catholicism. In general, I'm going to be showing, and some of this will reaffirm what Bill has spoken about, that Hispanic Catholics, and these are all Hispanics and all non-Hispanics, so Bill focused on the millennial generation, this is the whole sample. In general, they are more devout and more involved in the sacramental life of the church, and in general, they are also more deferential to authority, to church hierarchical authority. But there are some deviations, if you like, some more nuanced findings there that I'll also be highlighting. So if you look at this one, as I say, in terms of weekly Mass, non-Hispanics and Hispanics are the same. But in terms of monthly, which has become now the more regular form of Mass participation, Hispanics tend to go more frequently monthly than do the non-Hispanics. But some might be surprised that Hispanics as a whole don't go more often at a weekly level, because there is this sense that they might, but they don't. They're also more likely than the non-Hispanics to believe that in the consecration, the bread and wine actually becomes the body and blood of Jesus. So again, there's that more, if you like, devoutness there. And in response to a question asking whether the sacraments of the church are essential to their relationship with God, Hispanics are more likely, 52% of Hispanics compared to only a third of the non-Hispanic Catholics say that, so that they really see the essentialism. Now, people may not think of essential as really essential, but at least that's the question asked, and on this we see some variation. We again see, we'll look a little repetitious of some of the things we talked about this morning. When we ask people what aspects of Catholicism are personally very important to them, going from the issues of Jesus' resurrection, the Blessed Virgin, down to issues of celibacy, Vatican authority, we see in all of those items, basically, that the non-Hispanics, other than Mary, the Hispanics are, in all of these instances, more likely than the non-Hispanics to emphasize these aspects. So more Hispanics will check the box, basically. And I want to just reiterate, Dr. Cahill's point this morning. This is one of the weaknesses of survey research in general as a methodology. You're only asking about attitudes a lot of the time, but even when you ask about practices, there tends to be social desirability, where people tend to overstate how much they go to Mass, or how often they go to Mass, or how much do they give to the poor, or how much they love whatever it is you're asking them. Nonetheless, aside from that problem, you can still compare groups. So even though people can vary in how they answer questions, I think when you do get some sense that there are real group differences, whether it's between men and women, Hispanics and non-Hispanics. But ideally, of course, you would like to complement these survey data with observations, looking at parishes in practice and seeing what actually people do, and following people the rest of the week to see how they live their lives. So again, you see that the Hispanics are more likely to emphasize these aspects of being very important. And similarly, when it comes to what it is that's very meaningful to them, the Hispanics in blue here are more likely to say the emphasis on the sacraments, for example. to say shared communality and the Mass here at the very end. So you sort of get the trends in these data that they are, in fact, that the Hispanic Catholics are more devout and more involved in the Church's tradition. And finally, of course, can one be a good Catholic? We see the Hispanics, too, are less likely than the non-Hispanics to say that you can do all kinds of things and still be a good Catholic. Nonetheless, despite that difference, you'll see that substantial numbers of Hispanic Catholics have the same views, more or less, as the non-Hispanics, that in fact there's quite a bit of autonomy, and personal autonomy or non-church autonomy in terms of what you define as a good Catholic. So that's sort of summarized, but to add, and this was something that Bill mentioned as well about the locus of authority, and this actually goes to Dr. Cahill's point this morning about the moral vacuum, if you like, or when we talk about autonomy, it exists in a larger cultural context, which I totally agree exists. But this question asks, do you get your opinions? Who has the final say when it comes to making up their minds about what's right and what's wrong? On particular issues, asking, is it the individuals themselves, is it church leaders, or is it people together, the church leaders and individuals? And in all of these things, you see, or at least on some of these things, on contraception, Hispanics are less likely than non-Hispanics to say that individuals, even though it's still a majority, it's 60%, say that it's really individuals rather than church leaders who have the final say. And also on, can you remarry without an annulment? There's a big difference again between the Hispanics and the non-Hispanics. And similarly on abortion, where there is some difference, interestingly enough, is on non-marital sex, that is sex that's not within marriage, and on homosexual activity. So that while Hispanic Catholics are more deferential to the church hierarchy on contraception and remarrying and on abortion, on these aspects of sexuality, that difference disappears. And this is also evident when you look at the support for same-sex relationships. Dr. Cahill mentioned this morning. These data are actually from the Public Religion Institute survey that she mentioned. And that was carried out in March, or was published in March of this year. When you look at support for same-sex marriage, 45% of Latino Catholics supported and 41% of white Catholics. Support for civil unions, white Catholics are more likely than Latino Catholics, and when it comes to no legal recognition, Latino Catholics are more likely to say, yes, there shouldn't be legal recognition than white Catholics. I think what's interesting here is the fact that it raises an issue about question wording, among other things, which is, what are civil unions? What is same-sex marriage? And depending on various surveys, we know from other surveys that a good 50%, definitely of Catholics, a good 50% support same-sex marriage. But depending on how the wording is, whether it comes as a question after same-sex unions as opposed to civil marriage, as opposed to marriage in a church, it varies. So just some caution on that. Nonetheless, it is interesting that in terms of support for same-sex marriage, just as a principle, that Latino Catholics and white Catholics are basically sharing of the same opinion on that. And I think the less support for the civil unions question there is perhaps because Latino Catholics don't like the notion of civil union. They prefer it to be a proper church sanctified union. That's, I think, my hypothesis that would need to be explored in further research. So it is an interesting, if you like, convergence between white Catholics, or between Hispanic Catholics and non-Hispanic Catholics. And this is leading me to my next point, which is that despite the fact that Hispanics on several of these items are more devout and are more deferential to church authority, there is an emerging consensus among them in terms of how they rank the various issues. And this, I think, is interesting because the title of my presentation today is Are Hispanics Changing the Character of American Catholicism? Clearly, they're changing American Catholicism. Yet when you look at what it is that they prioritize over others, they basically follow the same priorities as do the white Catholics. So again, they both, if you follow either the blue line or the red line as a whole line, the resurrection, helping the poor, and Mary and the sacraments are the most ranked, that most highly ranked for both groups, and the least ranked are Vatican authority and celibacy. So Convergence might be too strong a word, consensus might be too strong a word, but it's not as if Hispanic Catholics are saying celibacy or Vatican authority is very important to 2/3 of them, and that it's the opposite. In fact, they're paralleling the items that they most likely endorse as either very important in this case, and in the next one, in terms of what's very meaningful. So yes, while Hispanic Catholics are more likely to say that the Mass is very meaningful to them than the non-Hispanics, it again follows the similar line in terms of what they prioritize. And again, within this, we see that this point of the ability to be able to disagree with church teachings and still remain loyal to Catholicism, one might have thought that that was very much a white or a sort of a Euro-American way of being, but in fact it also seems to be the kind of mentality, the mindset that Hispanic Catholics are embracing as well. That they too, despite their generally more deferential attitude to church authority and to the hierarchy's teachings, they still find as very meaningful the fact that you can disagree and still remain a loyal Catholic. So I think that's an interesting finding. On attachment to the church, they're basically the same. These are not significant differences other than the third item there, being a Catholic is a very important part of who I am. Hispanics are, and on the one that they'd like their future generations to be Catholic, but by and large, their levels of commitment and attachment to the church are similar. And as I mentioned this morning, these are high levels of at least self-reported attachment. So we talked a little bit already this morning and in some of the conversation that the church is at a critical juncture. We've mentioned the continuing fallout from the sex abuse scandals, and we did ask in this iteration of the survey some questions about that. And one of the questions we asked them to agree or disagree whether the sex abuse by priests has hurt the credibility of church leaders who speak out on social or political issues. And as you see, similar numbers, 44%, 48%, similar numbers of Hispanics and non-Hispanics agreed with that. Okay, so that they felt not that it has hurt it a great deal. That's the most extreme category, not hurt it a little bit or hurt it somewhat, hurt it a great deal. And then, which in a sense we were somewhat surprised to see, that almost similar numbers said that it also has hurt the ability of priests to meet the pastoral and spiritual needs of the parishioners, 40% of Hispanics and 37% of non-Hispanics, because it seems expected that it's hard for a lot of American Catholics anyway, independent of the sex abuse crisis, to give a lot of credibility to some church statements on politics or the social issues. But nonetheless, we might make the argument that they still want to value the pastoral and spiritual care that they're receiving from priests. Yet, I think from some perspective at least, this is somewhat of concern to priests. To not only is the political credibility somewhat obviously diminished, but also perhaps their pastoral and spiritual ability to lead the flock and to truly, create those functions in the parish of being a good shepherd to the people. And again, here, of course, there aren't differences between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. The shortage of priests continuing. Mary Gauthier this morning talked about that. She talked about the number of priests declining substantially in America, and the fact that the shortfall is compensated to some extent by changes in terms of having more deacons, having more lay ministers in the parish. Nonetheless, of course, given that we keep emphasizing from our data that people value the Mass, and of course the Catholic Catechism of the Catholic Church emphasizes that the Eucharist is the source and summit of Catholic life. I mean, there's beautiful language there. It raises the question, if the Eucharist is the source and summit of Catholic life, well, what will happen to Catholic identity, both at the individual level and at the communal level, if there's a shortage of priests to celebrate the Eucharist? So again, I'm going to bring up the issue of women's roles in the church. Can we look to women to and change perhaps in theology? And thankfully, not only am I not an ethicist, I'm not a theologian, so I don't have to deal with the deep complexities of these issues. But it is, again, interesting to see whether are Hispanics bringing the American church in a more conservative, or might they bring it in a more conservative as opposed to a more liberal direction. And I think the body of evidence suggests that they won't be in the vanguard of change. They're not necessarily going to be holding back the church, if and it's a big if the church were to explore these complex theological questions with a view towards change. But you see that large majorities of both Hispanics and non-Hispanics support various roles for women in the church, the ones that I mentioned this morning, down from a reader at Mass all the way down to women priests. Nonetheless, the Hispanics on all of those items are slightly less likely to endorse any of those. So from reader at Mass to parish administrator, Eucharistic minister even, to deacon and to priest. So there's a lot of agreement. They're not huge differences in terms of percentage points. Nonetheless, there are gaps there with the Hispanics and all of these less open to supporting women's roles, even in positions, of course, that women themselves have. And this sort of seems somewhat surprising to me, given the fact that a lot of sociology, at least, that writes about Hispanic Catholicism talks about the role of women in local family communities and parish communities as having a very strong role and always having had a leadership role. And yet some of this data, at least, is sort of surprising, because in fact you might have thought that the Hispanic Catholics might be sort of pushing for more, or at least more of them pushing for women's roles rather than the non-Hispanic, but that's not evident, at least here. And then the acceptable options, Mary talked about some of these this morning. Sharing a priest with other parishes, again, the non-Hispanics are blue, the Hispanics are red. You see that the Hispanics are less open to change on all of these items, even though, somewhat similar percentages in many instances support, the ones that are more popular, such as sharing a priest with other parishes, or merging parishes into one, or bringing in a priest from another country. On all of those items, even though they're more popular among both groups, the Hispanics are less disposed to change. And the one that really sticks out in terms of the color contrast really is the closing of the parish, with the Hispanics less likely very much than the non-Hispanics to favor that option. So again, when we ask the question about the parish as a core structure of the church and in terms of a core communal binding force for Catholics, if we abandon the parish or if we reduce the power of the parish in Catholics' life, what would be the implications of that be, not just for Catholicism, but for the everyday practice and beliefs of Catholics, particularly as more Hispanics come into the church. And a percentage agreeing that it would be a good thing. Now, this is something I didn't show you this morning. This morning, we only showed you the data on what percentage might support, and earlier today, some roles for women in the church. This is a different question, and again, it points out that depending on where you ask a question and the context for the question, you can get very different responses. How many, we asked them, would it be a good thing if priests who were married were allowed to return to active ministry? And this was obviously in response to the shortage of priests. You can see that that's the most popular way of dealing with the priest shortage among these four items, with upwards of 45%. Again, the non-Hispanics are more in favor of all of these options. But that's the number one. The second one is married men were allowed, if married men were allowed to be ordained priests. And then when we come to the women's questions, if married women were allowed to be ordained as opposed to celibate women. So whatever it is about celibate women, they're the least endorsed possible option if it was a good thing. And you see, of course, icons die hard. I mean, the male, whether married or currently married or married and now returned, are preferred over women. So these are social science findings. I'm not making any non-partisan or whatever comments on them, but it does show that there is a lot of ferment in the church, there's a lot of openness in the church in terms of exploring possibilities for change and women's roles. Yet at the same time, when you scratch the surface a little bit, there can be some resistances, because after all, having a long history of male-only priesthood, it's very hard to maybe get that out of people's minds, even though we know from some other studies, Don, that those who have studied like women as lay parish administrators, sometimes there was resistance initially in the parish to having a woman in charge of the work of the church, but over time, the people in the parish really falling in love with this woman and saying what a great leader she is, what a great pastor she is, and so sometimes you have to actually implement change, and that's the way that you bring people along with it, and particularly when, the data we showed this morning, that women are more involved in the life of the church. So it almost seems like a natural extension of that to let them take on some of those real roles of ordination. But as I said, these are sociological, not theological issues for me, at least. Yes, so now shifting a little bit from these issues, again mentioning some of what I mentioned this morning, the American culture is undergoing change, and not only that decrease in religious preference that we talked about this morning, but also an increase in the numbers who say that they're spiritual but not religious. Today, about 24% of Americans, a quarter of Americans, describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. And Bill has alluded to this a few times about people who say, I don't go to Mass more often because I'm not that religious. Well, I have a comment on that first that comes from that book that was mentioned, In the Course of a Lifetime. As I said, this was an older generation of people, many of them Protestant, mainline Protestant and Catholic. Many of them were strongly religious all their lives. They did dip in and out. Church participation and religiosity changes depending on where people are in the life course. One of the things we found in that book was when people were in their 30s with young children, they were much more involved in the church, for example, because they were doing Sunday school teaching, they were dropping their kids and going to church themselves. But as soon as the kids left home and the freedom of the empty nest, a lot of the parents stopped going to church. They took up golf and other things. But then they came back to church in their late 60s and 70s, and it wasn't because they were afraid of death, because one of the things we found is that fear of death is something that's very stable over the life course, and that the more religious you are, the least afraid you are, as long as you practice your religion. But you just have more time in the post-retirement period to get back into church. So it does ebb and flow. But one of the, these are in-depth, as well as survey questions, there was in-depth interviews at all these different times in the life course. And there would be people talking, and it was clear to any researcher that these are obviously highly religious people. They went to church or religious services, they were active volunteering in their church and really believed in a lot of things. And then a few questions later, we said to them, well, would you consider yourself, or do you consider yourself a religious person? Several of these people said, oh no, because I think when people don't like to say, oh, I'm pious or I'm devout, so they say I'm not religious. So this is just to give some context to Bill's point today a couple of times when some people say, I don't go to Mass more often because I'm not that religious. I think in that case, it's really because they're not that committed. But we have to be careful, because a lot of time when people say I'm not religious, it doesn't mean that they don't believe in God and that they don't actually be strong practitioners of their religion. But anyway, that was an extended footnote. So one of the concerns about the increase in the number of people who are saying that they're religious but not spiritual is that for generations in America, the church has been a core center of communal engagement, of civic engagement for Catholics, but also particularly for mainline Protestants. And as we know, anyone who goes to church, if you go to church, oftentimes somebody will tap you on the shoulder and say, oh, would you get involved in this food pantry drive for next weekend, or will you join up this organization? So the church, not only through Catholic charities, is a very core part of the American communal structure in terms of helping society build it up, but also at the local level, churches are very important networks for getting people involved in their community. And so there is concern among some sociologists that as religious denomination, religious affiliation declines, that this will also bring about a weakening in the communal structures and civic engagement. But anyway, so in this study, we were looking and trying to probe a little bit about what does it mean to have this increase in society in general about being spiritual but not religious. So in our 2011 survey, this is how Catholics describe themselves. 47%, the blue on the right, say that they're religious and spiritual. 28% say that they're spiritual but not religious. 13% really goes along with the 47, say that they're religious but not spiritual, and 11% are neither. Okay. So you see here that even though quite a few, 28%, say that they're spiritual but not religious, nonetheless, a lot still identify as either religious or as religious and spiritual. And there was a good reason why Bill has been nervous over the years asking people, are they spiritual? Because what does it mean to people? Some people can be highly church-going and be spiritual in the St. Therese of Lisieux sense, or in a very mystical sense. Some people can be spiritual in terms of non-church or non-church tradition-based spirituality. Some of the current questions that are asked in other surveys, we replicated them in our survey to see who are these spiritual Catholics, or what do they believe. And we see that 42% believe that spiritual energy is located in physical things like mountains, rocks, and rivers. 36% say they believe in reincarnation, and 32% said they believe in yoga not just as a physical practice, but as a spiritual practice. So these are trends evident in the larger culture. So what does this portend for contemporary and future Catholicism? Well, we see, which may not be too surprising, that these are the highly committed Catholics I spoke about this morning who go to weekly Mass, who say they will never, ever leave the Catholic Church, and it's a very important part of their identity. About 20% of Catholics are highly committed. The highly committed are the least likely of all Catholics to embrace these types of spiritual beliefs. Nonetheless, substantial minorities of all of those actually do say, yes, they believe in yoga as a spiritual practice and physical energy located in different places. But you really see that it's the moderately committed friends, which is the majority of American Catholics, are actually more likely or as likely as the least committed to embrace these spiritual beliefs. And we see, even more strikingly, a lot of ethnic variation. On this, the Hispanics are red, so Hispanics are far more likely than non-Hispanic Catholics to embrace reincarnation, yoga as a spiritual practice, and the belief that spiritual energy is located in physical objects. So this is definitely one emerging trend in Catholicism. So Catholics in general are saying that they embrace these so-called new spiritual beliefs, and it includes highly committed as well as the least committed, but it's particularly evident among the Hispanic Catholics today. Should this be a source of concern? I think probably not, because Hispanic Catholics are most likely to combine these beliefs, these sort of non-traditional, if you like, church-based spiritual beliefs, with traditional beliefs. So, for example, as I mentioned at the very beginning, they're far more likely than non-Hispanic Catholics to say that the sacraments of the church are essential to their relationship with God. And they're also more likely to say that the Catholicism contains a greater share of truth than other religions. So it seems to me, as I look at these data, at least right now, that yes, Hispanic Catholics in particular are more likely than other Catholics to embrace yoga, for example, the idea that yoga is a spiritual practice or reincarnation, but it's not instead of their traditional participation, it's alongside and in combination with their participation in the Mass and in the sacraments. And so I think it's an interesting development in Catholicism, but I don't think it's necessarily going to change the nature or the character of Catholic practices a great deal. So in conclusion, Hispanic Catholics on the whole are more devout and more deferential to church authority than are non-Hispanic Catholics, but they're by and large similarly attached as non-Hispanics to the church, and they're slightly less supportive of women's roles in the church and less accepting of new possible arrangements in response to the shortage of priests. And even though, as I've just said, while they're more likely to embrace new spiritual beliefs, they are at the same time likely to combine those and keep them simultaneously with their attachment to the traditional aspects of Catholicism and to the sacraments. Thank you very much.